Hi, Lisa Pierce here with Packaging Digest. And many people have been asking about some of the impacts of the tariffs on the packaging business, on packaging business. And we have an opportunity today to talk with John Hart, who's the managing director of PMCF Investment Banking. That's Paul Michael Charlie Frank, PMCF Investment Banking. And he leads the firm's plastics and packaging verticals. So I thought, let's ask him what he thinks. Thanks first for joining us, John.
Yeah, Lisa, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. With all that's been going on in the news with tariffs and it's, things keep changing. Negotiations are ongoing and the deals keep seeming to change, the tariff percentages. But I'm just wondering, because you track the mergers and acquisitions and what's going on with the packaging supplier community, wondering, are North American packaging manufacturers looking for global mergers and acquisitions these days to maybe mitigate some of the impact of the tariffs on, their global business?
I think the short answer is yes. We track every publicly disclosed M&A transaction globally in packaging and have been doing so since 2005. We talk to a lot of the consolidators on a regular basis. We talk to private equity groups, and the tariffs, have definitely created a challenge, to say the least. Not only in running the business, but also in doing M&A transactions. The data would show that M&A is still very strong in spite of the tariffs.
Okay.
We are just wrapping up our 6-month data, and we do both a plastics M&A report and we also do a packaging M&A report. Within packaging, it includes plastics, but it also includes all the other substrates, metal, glass, machinery, composites, things like that. But the data would say that the deals this year are actually up compared to last year. Now, one thing to note with the data is that an M&A transaction typically takes multiple months to complete. I'd say a good rule of thumb is somewhere between 6 and 9 months. And so deals that are closing in the first half of 2025, they didn't start in 2025. They started, probably second or third quarter of 2024. And so they were well on their way, to closing,
right,
before all the tariff noise was introduced to the market. Now, we certainly, when Trump was elected, I think everybody knew that tariffs were coming, and obviously he tweeted, I think in November they were coming, and so people had a heads up, and we saw several deals that had a lot of cross-border or heavy import activity be highly scrutinized by buyers. So if we were representing a seller in a market where they were importing product, from another country, that was on the list. I mean, they were all on the list, but for high tariffs, certainly that would cause a buyer pause in terms of closing that transaction, or an investor, private equity group, underwriting that transaction. So we certainly, with deals where there were either imports of goods or supplies that goes into the packaging, or they were exporting goods, and there might be reciprocal tariffs. That was highly scrutinized, and we did see some transactions actually get put on hold. We actually had a couple at PMCF that were put on hold until there was more visibility on the tariffs. Now, we execute transactions on the sell side primarily, and a lot of our clients are in the U.S., but we certainly represent clients in Canada and Mexico as well. And that's where we saw probably most of the issues that our Canadian and Mexico clients, just the uncertainty around the tariffs. Now, the good news was, or is, that the USMCA goods, were exempt, from that initial round, but obviously there's still negotiations underway right now. So businesses that have a fair bit of cross-border activity are being more highly scrutinized now with the tariffs than before. But the deals are still getting done, and I think part of it is that packaging is largely domestic. A lot of the packaging players in the middle market, are working within the domestic market. There might be some crossover with Canada and Mexico, but largely U.S. packaging businesses, working within U.S. Certainly a number of global packaging players, but within the middle market and with clients that we typically work with, not seeing a significant impact from the tariffs as of now. And as a result, we've been able to close deals, and we've seen deals getting done in light of the tariff environment.
Okay, thanks for explaining all that. I know that when I first asked the question, I was looking at it from the point of view of the North American packaging machinery, or not machinery, just packaging manufacturers. Could be machine, it could be, the various materials. But you immediately went to the international folks as well, and that I didn't look at it from that perspective, but that definitely makes sense. If the import tariff is so high, if a foreign company, I'm just trying to understand this because I don't know myself, if a foreign company invests in a US company that has manufacturing here and does the manufacturing here, there's no tariff, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, that just makes sense to me. I mean, the whole point, I believe, for Trump's tariffs are to increase the amount of U.S. manufacturing. And if that was happening anyway, I can't imagine that that would be penalized somehow.
Yeah,
So,
where there's an issue though is if the input for the manufacturing, whether it be aluminum, plastics, or components,
sure,
we have packaging that's imported in the U.S. every day, and if a tariff gets put on something that's being imported and there isn't capacity to manufacture it here in the U.S., well, that impacts the company unless they pass it on, and a lot of these companies are just passing it on to the consumer. And I think that's really the concern that a lot of people have had on tariffs. Are tariffs simply just going to increase pricing and cause higher inflation, and also given that the U.S. is such a consumer-driven economy, would it cause the macro economy to contract with the higher prices? And so
sure.
tariffs certainly a complex issue, but I think the goal, at least my understanding, of the Trump administration, is to try to bring more manufacturing to the U.S. I think unfortunately it's much more complicated than simply putting a tariff on imported goods to drive that, because there's just not the capacity, and to build the capacity takes sometimes years to put into place.
Yes. Plus, as you already mentioned a little bit earlier, the whole issue of raw material acquisition, if that is still happening through imports, you're still going to be subject to the tariffs. I totally understand that. I'm wondering, I know that your firm tracks the M&As, mergers and acquisitions, but
Yes.
I would imagine as part of the business, keeping track of just the packaging supply community. I'm wondering if you've also maybe looked at how many North American packaging manufacturers have maybe expanded here in the US in 2025 or announced plans to expand here in the US. I'm just trying to determine if the tariff strategy, tactic, however you want to phrase it, um, is going to work in the packaging supply community to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Do you know?
Yes, I think it's too early to tell. I mean, we don't track greenfields or plant expansion announcements or companies saying, hey, we're going to open up a new plant or we're going to add capacity. My sense is I mean, I read the packaging news every day. My sense is there is an uptick in that activity, but I don't have specific data to point to. But what I do have is if I look at North American packaging buyers,
Mm-hmm.
what has been their activity, because we track global activity, but if we
Right.
just look at North America, how many companies have expanded just within the US, North American packaging manufacturers expanded in the US, and through the first 6 months of the year, we saw 27 M&A transactions by those manufacturers. And if you compare that to the same time period last year, it was 19, and then the prior year was 15. So
Oh,
we
my.
have seen an uptick. Now, is that directly related to the tariffs? That's hard to say. And
Hard
again,
to say.
as I mentioned before, these M&A transactions take time.
Right.
And so a lot of the deals that are showing up in our data and that are closing are deals that have been in the works for several months to close to a year in some cases. And but I don't think that the fact that it's up is a coincidence. I do think that there is a more of a focus on acquisitions in the U.S. Cross-border activity is something we track. Cross-border activity, oddly enough, is not up, so far this year. But I can say anecdotally, I've gotten a lot more inquiries from global packaging players to do acquisitions in the U.S. And they've either increased their activity or they're have launched new activities to gain a stronger presence into the U.S. And I think that tariffs will naturally do that, depending on where they all shake out, and the amount, candidly, to the where there's this, okay, do you continue to export or do you make it here? And
Right.
and so I think these global packaging, manufacturers, ones that, either have a presence here or don't have a presence here, I do think tariffs will drive an increase in M&A activity in the US, to avoid the potential impacts of those tariffs.
Okay. So perhaps maybe not a causation, but definitely a correlation with the tariffs and the M&A activity for packaging manufacturers.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, I know we've talked about the uptick in activity so far in 2025, the first 6 months. And I'm just wondering because you've got a little bit more insight because you're working on the deals that haven't been announced yet. What's your outlook for the remainder of the year? And then if you could give us a little bit of insight into why.
Yeah. So last year in packaging, we saw an uptick in overall deals. There were 322 deals in 2024. About 170 of those were strategic buyers. The balance was financial buyers.
Sure.
The strategic buyers really drove the increase in activity last year. This year, we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence of financial buyer activity, and we're also seeing deal activity be up so far this year compared to last. And I would say within PMCF, we are very busy, and we have a lot of deals in the queue. What does that mean for the balance of the year? You just don't know. The M&A market is a little bit tough to predict. We have, despite the higher levels of activity, we saw increases in each of the last 2 years. I talked to a lot of people that participate in packaging M&A, and I think they would tell you that packaging M&A was not great the last 2 years. So we saw an uptick in deals, but in terms of the types of deals, we did see some smaller deals. There was a higher concentration of foreign deals, and I think in general, people were not happy with domestic packaging M&A activity, whether it be the quality of the deals that were coming to market, or just the number of deals in general. And I think part of that had to do with companies coming out of what we call the COVID boom. A lot of packaging businesses benefited from COVID, and I think even in 2022 we saw companies having supply chain issues, so they were overbuying. And I'd say a lot of 2023, if you listen to the investor presentations, by all the publics, we heard this word destocking utilized quite a bit throughout the year. Historically, you'd hear destocking for maybe one quarter and then it would go away. But we heard that throughout 2023. And, a lot of the companies we looked at did not have great performance in 2023. Some did, but I'd say a good portion of packaging suppliers in 2023 did not have strong years. And then 2024 was a little bit better, but still not at the high levels you saw during the COVID boom. And so I think that company performance drives M&A activity. If you're a seller, you have a certain valuation expectation, and you need a certain level of financial performance to support your valuation expectation. If you're a buyer, you're in some cases supplementing your financial performance with M&A. But a lot of times, if you're not performing well, maybe you're not as aggressive on M&A. And so we do see company performance on both buyers and sellers impact M&A activity. And I guess this is a long way of saying is with financial performance coming back in 2024 and 2025, it's still not as strong as people would like to see. But in general, we're seeing companies do better. That is spurring more M&A activity. In fact, there's companies that would have transacted in 2024 if they had better 2023 performance. But because they didn't, they held off on pursuing a transaction until they got through 2024, and now they're pursuing a transaction. And I think that's what's actually driving some of the increase in activity. Certainly, you have a tariff impact, which is hurting some deals, but I think this pent-up demand in deals due to company performance has offset any tariff impact in packaging. Now, the question is, will that revert in the second half of the year or not? I think the M&A, my prediction, and obviously, nobody can predict exactly what's going to happen, but just given the amount of activity we've been seeing in the second quarter of 2025 and really the end of the first quarter of 2025, it would signal to us that we're going to see a strong second half of the year. Will it be as strong as the first half? I don't know, but I think it should be similar to at least 2024. But again, that's all based on anecdotal information as opposed to hard data. Deals are up.
Sure.
So certainly you could look at that and say, okay, well, that's a good indicator. Stock market performance is something we look at. Stock market performance has been strong. That's a good leading indicator. Question, really, a lot of people's minds, going back to your initial comment or question is, how are these tariffs going to impact, the macro economy? Where are we going to shake out relative to tariffs? I know August 1st is another, key date. Will that then get pushed again? And, where is this all going to shake out? How is it going to impact the macro economy? And then how's that going to trickle down into packaging company performance? That will, ultimately determine, how strong M&A activity is.
Okay. There's two things that you said that I want to follow up on. One of them is really just a comment. You talked about the number of deals, and I know that that kind of activity is important, but isn't also the size of the deals important in the strength of the M&A market for packaging supply?
Yes. I mean, I think in terms of, if you look at, the 322 deals that happened in 2024, the large mega deals are a very small minority. We have certainly seen an uptick in the larger deals, but that's really not going to move the needle, if you will, in terms of overall M&A activity. But I do think that
Right.
it is an encouraging sign, that M&A activity is getting better or increasing, because, why would these companies do it? I think with
Right.
the mega deals we've seen in packaging so far, I don't know if I would necessarily say there's enough there to draw parallels to, oh, the market's now, at its, optimal place. I mean, I would say M&A in general, if you're a seller, from a level of activity and a multiple perspective, is still not, fully optimized. But it
Okay.
has been improving the last 18 months, which has been encouraging. And, we're all hoping that it continues to improve. We are all also hoping, for some interest rate cuts, which certainly help M&A activity and they help valuation. So I think that will also help spur activity. But the other side of it too is not necessarily the mega deals, but the kind of the upper middle market deals, or even kind of the middle market deals, if you will. We're seeing more of those. And so that's been an encouraging sign as well.
Okay. I will have to come back to the levels of the market deals that you talked about, because I'm not familiar with them. But before I get into that, I did want to just ask, so the second thing that I thought of when you were talking earlier was your comment about the strategic deals versus like investment deals. And to me, I see the strategic deals as being a little bit more solid than the investment deals, because I look at that as it's a long-term investment in packaging and the packaging supply market. I could be wrong on that, but that's how I see it. And so I was just wondering, for the, tariff impacts, potential tariff impacts, are those more financial investment than they are strategic? Or should I not read too much into that?
It's a great question. I would say, for you think about the global packaging businesses, those are, largely owned, by the stock market. And so to see a, uptick there, uh, you know, I think that's a, accurate correlation in terms of the larger strategics uh, being more acquisitive, as a result of, some of the tariff activity, depending on where they're manufacturing goods. Like if they're manufacturing goods, say in a low cost country, would they then, look to, move manufacturing to the US, because of the potential tariffs? I think that is likely, depending on, what capacity they have already. Uh, so, I think that's a, accurate correlation. But I guess one comment you made about financial, I think the financial buyers or private equity, are a big driver of the M&A activity in packaging. They represent, pretty high percentage of the overall activity, and they're here to stay. They've been consolidating the packaging industry, since I've been covering it for 20 years, and their activity hasn't gone down, it's gone up. and
I'm not
so,
complaining at all, because any investment in the packaging industry helps it grow. So I think that's all good news, as long as they're patient investors, I guess is the way I would phrase it.
yeah, I mean, every private equity group's different, in terms of their level of patience, but most are, 5-year investors. So they're going to buy a business, they're going to look to optimize it, grow it organically, and then do add-on acquisitions, and then sell it and return the capital to their investor group. Now there's a kind of a new emerging pool of capital we call family office, where they're investors for more the long term, where they invest and then they hold it either indefinitely or 10 to 15 years. We've seen that. There's still a minority of the quote unquote financial buyers, but a good percentage of the packaging deals that we see, by private equity, they're buying them, to hold them for 5 years, give or take. Some might be, 5 to 7, some might be more 3 to 5. But if you look at, a lot of the deals that they're doing, they are enhancing those businesses. They're professionalizing them, they're investing in them, they're growing them, they're, consolidating, subsectors within the industry, and, spurring probably more innovation, in things like sustainability, that I think help the industry. But they're certainly making it tougher for smaller businesses to compete, because, these financial buyers have, deeper pockets, and they're more aggressive with their capital. And
Sure.
so I think in terms of their activity going, going down, I don't necessarily see that. I see them, largely doing the same. In fact, we're seeing, private equity deals now, being recycled, where they were, private equity did a deal, they did a number of add-ons, and now they're coming back to market. And so there's this, kind of number of deals that happen every year that is just, private equity groups, getting through their cycle. And a lot of times they'll sell to another private equity group, which will then bring a different level of expertise, to that company, and help it grow, say, to the next level.
Right.
Very global. I think, they started off as a pretty small, business, and they went through a multitude of private equity groups before ultimately going public. And so they would be probably a classic example of how private equity can help grow a business.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings me to my last question very nicely, because I do want you to explain a little bit to me, and to maybe other folks who are watching. What do you mean by the markets, the middle market? You mentioned middle market. what are those market levels? And I'm assuming they just indicate the size of a company.
Yes, I'd say that in the M&A community, people define the middle market differently. Some would say a middle market company would be 20 million to say 500 million in enterprise value. Others would define it as more, say, 100 million to 2 billion.
Oh,
And
that's quite a difference.
yeah, and there's a category that's been utilized maybe the last 5 to 8 years. This lower middle market is what people have been using, and I think that's really kind of 20 million to 150 million in enterprise value. So when I made the comment earlier, it was a little bit tongue in cheek because there is there's a little bit, depends on who you talk to, is how you define the middle market. And so at PMCF we would consider the middle market you're really starting at 50 million in enterprise value and going up to about 500 million in enterprise value.
Okay.
And above 500 million would be either the upper middle market or a larger deal. And again, everybody has a little bit different lens on that.
Sure, sure. Thanks for explaining that. I know I've been covering the packaging industry as a journalist for more than 40 years. And when I first started, there were a whole lot more of the smaller, mom and pop organizations. And, the over the years, packaging has really become a lot more of a sophisticated business, I would
Mhm.
say. And I'm not knocking the smaller companies, but as you mentioned, different levels of investment allow companies to be a little bit more innovative here and there and just grow. And so we do still have quite a few of the smaller companies that are innovative, and that's one of the things that I like a lot about the covering the packaging industry. Is there's cycles of entrepreneurial innovations, and then some of those larger companies would then acquire these uh, startups, these innovative startups, and it's just a cycle that continues to go on. But it's good to see. It's one of the reasons why the packaging business is so interesting to cover. Um, John, thank you so much for your insights into this. And we should follow up again at the end of the year to see how 2025 and the tariff situation and M&As all shake out.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And I will say, in terms of your comment about smaller companies competing, it's been interesting to watch. So I've been covering packaging for 20 plus years. I've seen larger companies or mid-sized companies get larger, and in some cases lose that nimbleness or that customer service or that willing to customize or innovate and serve a customer. And large customers move their business from a large packaging supplier to more of a smaller middle market size packaging supplier for that very reason. And then I've seen larger companies cycle where they go to where they only want to deal with the larger customers, and then they find their margins get impacted, and then they go back and say, well, hey, we like some of that more customized, innovative business that we used to do. And then they buy companies that really benefited from their change in direction. And so it's packaging is really fascinating industry segment. I feel like I'm learning something every day. And I
You
think
and me
that
both.
there are a lot of very strong smaller businesses out there that are doing very well competing with the larger players through innovation, through flexibility, through offering, low or medium run size. And it's great to see. And then you have this, kind of push pull with the larger players, trying to make sure they're optimizing their portfolio. But one thing that is certain, I would say that I've seen over the last 20 years is that it is getting more costly to compete in packaging. In terms of you have to have the type of machinery, higher speed machinery in some cases, and so it is tough on the capital side. But I've been fortunate to see a number of small family businesses stay family owned and grow into multi-billion-dollar companies. And so certainly that opportunity, still within packaging.
Great. Well, John, again, thank you so much for your time and your sharing your expertise. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.